Dear viewers, the following stories are inspired by real events. However, the names of the characters have been changed to protect privacy. Story 1. Scary Weekend Getaway. Liam, Sophia, Noah, and Chloe, whose real names were Ethan, Olivia, Jacob, and Maya, 4 close friends decided to enjoy a weekend getaway at a secluded cabin in the Pisgah National Forest in North Carolina in the fall of 2023. They were all excited about the idea of a quiet place, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, where they could relax and enjoy the fresh air. The wooden cabin looked rustic and charming when they arrived, but there was a slightly strange atmosphere surrounding it, an indescribable feeling that made Sophia a little uneasy. The first night passed relatively peacefully. They built a campfire, grilled meat, and told each other jokes. However, as the late night approached and everyone had gone inside the cabin to sleep, they began to hear strange noises outside. The rustling of leaves, the snapping of branches, and even strange howls echoed from afar. They tried to reassure each other that it was just wild animals in the forest. But as the night wore on, those noises grew louder and closer. They started hearing scratching sounds on the wooden walls of the cabin, as if someone was trying to claw their way inside. Noah, who was usually the jokester, tried to lighten the mood with jokes, but Sophia's worried expression betrayed her real fear. The next morning, after a nearly sleepless night, the group decided to explore the surrounding forest to dispel the heavy atmosphere. They followed a small trail, and before long, they found an old, moss-covered cemetery deep in the woods. The ancient, crooked tombstones with faded inscriptions created a gloomy and eerie scene. Everyone felt an indescribable sense of unease as they stood among these cold graves. Chloe, who was particularly sensitive to the supernatural, felt a strong negative energy emanating from this place. When they returned to the cabin in the afternoon, the strange phenomena began to intensify. Doors creaked open and then slammed shut on their own. Objects inside the house seemed to shift, and they began to hear faint whispers echoing somewhere in the air. Liam, who was practical and didn't believe in ghosts, tried to find logical explanations for everything, but even he began to feel that something was wrong. Chloe, in a moment alone in the upstairs bedroom, saw a fleeting shadowy figure pass by in the mirror, causing her to scream in terror. They tried to leave the cabin, but when they got to the car, it wouldn't start. Noah checked everything carefully but couldn't find the cause. Their cell phones also had no signal, leaving them completely isolated. The whole group began to feel desperate and truly scared. The second night was even more terrifying than the first. They heard loud banging on the walls, the sound of furniture being dragged and thrown around, and the shadowy figures became clearer in the darkness. Liam, who had been the most skeptical, had a direct and terrifying encounter with an unseen entity when he felt someone grab his leg and pull him hard off the bed. He screamed in horror, and from that moment on, he fully believed in what was happening. In desperation, they tried to communicate with whatever was haunting the cabin, hoping to understand its intentions. They found an old diary in a trunk in the attic, telling the story of a woman named Agnes who had lived in this cabin in the 1920s. She had been brutally murdered right in the cabin, and the killer was never caught. They suspected that Agnes's vengeful spirit was the one tormenting them. They tried various ways to appease Agnes's spirit, but all their efforts failed. Instead, the supernatural phenomena became more violent and threatening. On the final night, as all 4 of them were holed up in the living room, the windows suddenly shattered, and an icy gust of wind rushed in. They clearly saw a faint figure of a woman floating in the middle of the room. Her face filled with sorrow and anger. She lunged towards them, and the group knew they were in extreme danger. In a chaotic moment, they tried to flee the cabin. Liam found the car keys and tried to start the engine again. This time, the car started. They sped out of the cabin and drove frantically down the dusty trail. Not daring to look back, the weekend getaway that was supposed to be relaxing had turned into a terrifying nightmare they would never forget. Story 2. Ghost in the Premature Honeymoon. Sarah and Mark, whose real names were Jessica and Michael, had only been dating for a few months but felt a special connection. To heat up their romance and have a memorable experience, they decided to go on a weekend getaway to a historic bed and breakfast called the Black Swan Inn in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in late spring of 2019. Gettysburg was famous for its ghost stories related to the bloody battle in the American Civil War, and the Black Swan Inn was rumored to be one of the most haunted locations. Sarah, who loved the mysterious, was very excited, while Mark was somewhat skeptical but still went along with his girlfriend's wishes. When they arrived, the inn looked very charming with its antique architecture and meticulously manicured gardens. Mrs. Eleanor, whose real name was Mrs. Patricia, the innkeeper, an elderly woman with a kind smile, warmly greeted them. She told them about the history of the inn, which had been around for over 200 years and had served as a refuge for wounded soldiers during the Battle of Gettysburg. She also didn't forget to mention the stories of spirits that still lingered there. Sarah seemed very interested, while Mark just smiled and brushed it off. Their first night passed quite peacefully. They had a romantic dinner in the inn's antique dining room and then took a walk together under the moonlight. When they returned to their room, they felt a bit chilly but thought it was just the weather. However, after they got into bed and turned off the lights, they began to hear strange noises coming from the hallway outside. Soft footsteps, sometimes like someone dragging something across the wooden floor. Sarah timidly asked Mark if he heard anything, and he nodded slightly, his expression a little worried. As the night wore on, the noises became clearer and more frightening. They heard very faint whispers right beside their ears, although they couldn't make out what anyone was saying. Suddenly, the bedside lamp on the table next to the bed turned on by itself and then went off completely. Sarah hugged Mark tightly, feeling a wave of fear spread through her body. Mark tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just an electrical problem. The next day, they decided to explore the town of Gettysburg and learn more about its history. They visited the battlefield, where some of the fiercest battles of the Civil War had taken place, and heard stories about the soldiers who had fallen there. Both Sarah and Mark felt a sense of heaviness and gloom pervading the atmosphere. They also visited some souvenir shops and heard tales of ghosts often appearing in the town's old buildings. When they returned to the inn in the afternoon, the atmosphere seemed heavier. They felt like someone was watching them, and the strange noises started again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps and whispers, but they also heard the sound of furniture being moved downstairs. Sarah began to feel truly scared. She wanted to leave immediately. Mark, although still a bit skeptical, couldn't deny what they were experiencing. Their second night was many times more terrifying than the first. They were awakened by a loud banging on their bedroom door. Mark quickly turned on the light and went to open the door, but no one was there. When they returned to bed, they heard the giggling of children echoing from the end of the hallway. Sarah trembled and held Mark's hand tightly, tears starting to fall. They felt completely helpless and trapped in this cold room. Suddenly, their bedroom door slowly opened on its own. A gust of icy wind swept into the room, carrying a musty odor. Before their eyes, a faint figure appeared in the middle of the room. It was the image of a man wearing an old military uniform, his face pale and full of sorrow. Sarah screamed in terror, while Mark stood frozen in place, unable to believe what he was seeing. The ghost slowly moved towards them, its hollow eyes staring intently at Sarah. She felt a cold hand touch her cheek. Mark finally came to his senses, lunged forward, grabbed Sarah, and tried to pull her out of bed. Together, they ran out of the room, leaving the ghost hovering in the air. They ran frantically down the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the dark hallway. When they reached the lobby, they saw Mrs. Eleanor standing there, her face pale and worried. She said she had also heard the strange noises and felt the presence of a supernatural force. She told them the story of a young soldier who had died in their room during the Battle of Gettysburg, and his spirit still lingered there. Unable to find peace, Mrs. Eleanor advised them to leave the inn immediately for their own safety. Sarah and Mark didn't hesitate to agree. They quickly packed their belongings and left the Black Swan Inn in the middle of the night. Their romantic weekend getaway had turned into a terrifying experience, a story they would tell each other for years to come. Despite the fear, they had gone through those horrifying moments together, and their relationship seemed to have become stronger after this haunting premature honeymoon. Story title: Ghost at the Remote Resort. Emily and Ben, whose real names were Olivia and James, were two colleagues who had recently started working together at a tech startup in Seattle. They didn't really know each other until they were both sent on a mandatory team-building retreat to an old resort nestled deep in the Catskill Mountains of New York in late autumn of 2022. Both Emily and Ben felt a bit awkward as it was the first time they had spent time alone together outside of the office. The Grandview Lodge resort looked grand but also quite dilapidated and isolated. Set apart from any town, the other colleagues mostly kept to themselves, making Emily and Ben feel even more out of place. Their first night passed relatively quietly, although both felt an underlying sense of unease about the place. Their rooms were at opposite ends of the second-floor hallway, and they only saw each other during the daytime training sessions, which were rather dull and didn't help them connect much. That night, upon returning to their rooms, both Emily and Ben began to experience strange phenomena. Emily heard faint scratching noises coming from inside her room's walls, like someone lightly clawing. Ben, on the other hand, was repeatedly awakened by creaking sounds and footsteps in the hallway, even though he was sure no one was out there. Initially, they both tried to ignore these occurrences, attributing them to the resort's age. However, on the second night, these phenomena became clearer and more frightening. Emily woke up to find the bedside lamp on her table flickering on and off by itself. She tried to flip the switch, but the light continued to blink erratically. Ben was awakened by a loud banging on his room door, as if someone was trying to break in. He quickly turned on the light and opened the door but found no one there. He felt an icy gust of air brush past his face. The next morning, at breakfast, Emily and Ben hesitantly told each other about their strange experiences. They realized they had both gone through similar things. On the third night, everything became unbearable. Both Emily and Ben heard very loud noises coming from downstairs, like furniture being thrown around. They decided to go down together to check. When they reached the first floor, they found the living room dark and cold. The old piano in the corner of the room began to play discordant, ghostly notes on its own. They saw faint shadows flitting across the hallway. Emily felt a cold hand touch her shoulder, and she screamed in terror. Ben quickly pulled her back to their rooms. They tried to call the front desk to report the incidents, but the phone in their room wasn't working. They decided they had to leave the resort immediately. However, when they got to the parking lot, Ben's car wouldn't start. They tried their best, but it was no use. A sudden snowstorm rolled in, blocking the road leading out of the resort. They were completely trapped and increasingly scared. The fourth night was a night of terror. The supernatural phenomena became more intense and malevolent. They heard blood-curdling screams echoing from the empty rooms. Their room door was repeatedly slammed shut, and the ghostly figures became clearer. Ben, who was usually a strong and rational person, clearly saw the figure of a woman in white standing at the end of his bed. He screamed in horror. Emily, although very scared, tried to remain calm and encourage Ben. They realized they had to rely on each other to get through this terrifying night. In desperation, they began to research the history of the resort. They found some old documents in the resort's small library, telling the story of a tragic murder that had occurred in the 1930s. A young bride had been brutally murdered in the resort on her wedding night, and her spirit was said to still haunt the place, seeking revenge. Emily and Ben believed they were facing the tormented and vengeful spirit of the unfortunate bride. They tried various ways to appease the bride's spirit, but all their efforts were in vain. The supernatural phenomena continued to plague them, becoming even more dangerous. The climax occurred on their last night. As Emily and Ben were barricaded in Emily's room, the windows suddenly shattered, and an icy gust of wind rushed in. The ghost of the bride appeared right in front of them, her face filled with resentment and hatred. She lunged at Emily with a terrifying scream. Ben quickly pushed Emily out of the way and faced the ghost. In a moment of struggle, Ben felt an invisible force squeezing his neck. He tried to fight back but couldn't break free. Emily, in a panic, found a candle and an old Bible on the table. She quickly lit the candle and began to read from the Bible. The faint light of the candle seemed to have an effect. The ghost shrieked in pain and recoiled. Ben seized the opportunity to pull Emily out of the room and downstairs. They fled the resort in the snowstorm, never daring to look back. The terrifying experience at the remote resort became a haunting memory for the rest of their lives. But it also created a special bond between Emily and Ben, two colleagues who had just met. Hopefully this true story has brought you thrilling and creepy moments. If you like horror stories, real ghosts like this, don't forget to click the subscribe button to not miss the next videos. Goodbye and see you again.